Welcome to Friday's edition of COVID-19. I'm Min San-hee. Now, despite hopes for a decline in daily numbers, it looks like we'll be ending the work week with more than 100 infections here in Korea. Meanwhile, over in the US, the daily tally has been hitting above 100,000 cases in recent days amid uncertainty over the outcome of the country's presidential race. And speaking of that, we are poised to touch upon elections across the world amid the pandemic in today's studio session. Here now is our Kwon So-ah with the latest numbers on the pandemic. So a further rise in cases here in Korea today, right?
Yes, Sunny, that's reason enough for concern ahead of the weekend. Cluster infections at high-risk venues as well as infections during day-to-day activities is what's leading to this increase, not exponentially, but steadily since Wednesday. We went from 118 to 125, 20 more. Now we're at 145. And also, we are seeing an increase in domestic infections, which have been above 100 for the second straight day. This is also the highest number that we're seeing in 2 weeks, and the number of imported cases has also risen, standing at 28. So with that, South Korea now has a total of 27,195 infections. The death toll stands at 476. We have a little less than 1,900 people who remain under treatment or in quarantine, but we also have over 24,800 people who made a full recovery from COVID-19.
I see. So what do the latest numbers mean for the revised social distancing guidelines that are poised to go into effect this Saturday?
Right, Sunny. According to the revised social distancing measures here in the nation, which were announced last weekend, beginning tomorrow, the 5-tier system will take effect from the earlier 3-tier system. Now, officials say they will probably remain for the time being at level 1, the lowest level in the majority of the nation, because the average in the past week of domestic infections was under 100. And Prime Minister Jung Se-kyun this Friday reiterated the government's confidence in this new system.
Some voices of concern have been raised on whether the government is prioritizing the economy over virus containment. But I would like to re-emphasize that the revamped social distancing guidelines are aimed at balancing prevention and a sense of normalcy in our daily lives through targeted measures.
Now, as I said, most of the nation will be under the lowest level, but Chungcheongnam-do province leveled up their measures to 1.5 as of 6 p.m. yesterday, and that is as provincial governments can make their own decisions depending on their situation. And speaking of that situation here in Chungcheongnam-do province, there are 25 new infections reported on Friday, and this is as there has been a cluster infection at a call center in the city of Cheonan. That is why Cheonan and Asan now for preventative measures are now under 1.5 level measures, and that includes restrictions to public use facilities or multi-purpose facilities. We also have 40 cases in the capital Seoul this Friday, 47 in Gyeonggi-do province, and also 13 over there in Gyeongsangnam-do province. And out of the 28 infections that were categorized as overseas cases, 12 were from the U.S. And speaking of the U.S., on Thursday, 10 American servicemen or family members tested positive with the virus in Pyeongtaek after recently arriving here in the country. And that is no wonder, because the U.S. is seeing exponential surges of 100,000 cases in recent days, now at 9.9 million. And France had over 58,000 cases in just a day, now at 1.6 million here. And the UK has surpassed Colombia in total cases. So we really see these European countries are dealing with resurgences due to the second wave of the pandemic. If we go over to other places, Germany also hit a record high figure of around 20,000 new cases, surpassing 600,000 cases in total. And we see the Ukraine here becoming the country with the 20th highest number of infections in the world. So more and more European countries are one of the hotspots around the world. And with that, the global entire figure stands at 49 million, and almost 600,000 cases were reported between noon Korea time Thursday and Friday. So we are probably going to see another record high figure in daily cases soon. Also, over 8,600 fatalities were reported in just a day. And those are the updates I have for now. Stay safe over the weekend, and I'll be back with more on Monday. Back to you, Sunny.
Right, so thank you for that. I'll see you back on Monday. Right, back here on the local front, the colors of autumn are in full bloom, and many are taking to scenic locations across the country to better indulge in the sights of the season. One such place here in Seoul is the Stonewall Pathway that lines the historic Deoksugung Palace. And our Chun Song-cho is there right now. Hello, Song-cho.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
So, Song-cho, do walk us through the pathway.
Yes, so this is Deoksugung Stonewall Walkway, which is arguably the most beautiful, most popular romantic road in Korea. I mean, there's even a song written about this walkway, right? So this pathway stretches 1 kilometer in length all the way from Seoul City Hall to Cheongdong Theater against the backdrop of Seoul's urban space. So in the heart of the capital, you can take a light stroll while enjoying the stunning view that's really hard to miss. I mean, look at all these ginkgo trees, guys. The leaves are so yellow and vibrant, and they'll make such a great picture for your social media post if you're into that sort of thing. Actually, right now is the best time to visit the place because the autumn foliage is at its peak right now. All right, and if you actually come at a certain time of the day or the week, then you can even walk on the road freely because the road will be closed to traffic. So more space, outdoor. I think it checks all the boxes for a place to go in the middle of a pandemic, right? So down the road this way, you'll see museums like Museum of Arts, Seoul Museum of Arts, and Seoul History Museum. So you can pop into those places if you have some time to kill. And over the stone wall, of course, there's Deoksugung Palace, where there's a pleasant surprise waiting for us. So I will show you exactly what it is. But for now, I'm going to turn things back to you, Sunny, in the studio.
All right, Song-cho, we'll be sure to join you back later for that surprise, and bye for now. Right, mass production and timely distribution of COVID-19 test kits have played a significant role in keeping the pandemic within relative control here in the country. Granted, this control was rendered possible amid the government's streamlined procedure for emergency use approval, dedicated R&D efforts by the private sector, as well as targeted investments in support of these endeavors. We have details in this next report.
This production facility, run by a Korean biotech firm on the outskirts of Seoul, manufactures thousands of COVID-19 test kits on a daily basis. Since the month of March, the firm has exported its COVID-19 diagnostic kits to many countries, including the US, Canada, and Brazil.
판매량으로 키트 수로 말하기보다는 몇 분이 테스트를 했다는 걸로 말씀드리기 때문에 현재까지 지금 누적된 테스트 수량으로 보면 5천만 테스트 정도 됩니다.
With the COVID-19 pandemic taking a dramatic turn for the worse in many parts of the globe, the spotlight has fallen once again on Korea's effective handling of the outbreak and its airtight containment strategy. One media outlet in Austria, which recently crossed the grim threshold of 100,000 total cases, published a headline that read, quote, "Learn from Korea." A key pillar of Korea's effective containment strategy was its expedited development and distribution of test kits in volumes that were sufficient enough to allow for testing on a mass scale.
1월 27일 날 그 당시 질병관리본부에서 관련 업계 여러 회사분들을 모시고 이것이 메르스보다는 더 크게 유행할 것 같으니 민간의 검사 능력을 확대하는 것이 빠르게 필요로 하다. 저희가 이제 시기적절하게 시약을 공급할 수 있어서 하루에 2만 테스트 가까운 검사량을 감당할 수 있었던 것입니다.
By the end of September, Korea had already exported roughly $1.2 billion worth of test kits in the year so far. Korean-made test kits have been sold to around 160 countries all across the globe, in enough quantities to test some 340 million people. Among its many achievements, this firm has already signed a long-term supply agreement with UNICEF, and its test kits have garnered praise for their accuracy and reliability.
I think the Korean test kits are being used abroad because they're reliable, easy to use, and they have been widely distributed. And so it's very successful. You had a strong national policy that was based in science. Then it was widely communicated in a sustained way to the population. And then you did widespread testing with the test kit.
The month of October marked the beginning of the influenza season, which compounded existing worries stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic. A so-called twindemic of COVID-19 and flu cases is threatening to overwhelm Korea's healthcare system. In light of this concern, many local firms have started developing dual-purpose test kits that can diagnose both COVID-19 and influenza. The latest dual-purpose test kits developed by this company has been given the green light for exports to Europe.
The symptoms of the flu and COVID-19 are similar, so it's difficult to distinguish them by only symptoms. In order to reduce the cost of quarantine and unnecessary isolation of patients, it's very important to test the flu and COVID-19 together at the same time.
The mass distribution of reliable test kits has helped Korea escape the worst of the pandemic and keep its outbreak under control. And it is hoped that they can also help other countries do the same amid the worsening pandemic.
It's clear that we're winning enough states to reach 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency.
If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. If you count them.
押後4年一度嘅立法會換屆選舉係非常艱難嘅決定。
Elections, big and small, have been taking place across the world as governments embrace a new normal that is largely being dictated by the pandemic. Now, for more on our efforts to adapt to these tough times politically, I have Dr. Woo Jung-yup from Sejong Institute. Welcome back, Dr. Woo.
Thanks for having me.
And I also have Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University. Pleasure to have you back, Professor Cho.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining our talk virtually is Professor Robert Krimmer from the University of Tartu in Estonia. Thank you for being with us, Professor Krimmer, at this early hour.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Right. Dr. Woo, we'll start with you then. The US presidential race is perhaps garnering the most global attention at the moment. In fact, as we speak, what are your thoughts on the latest events there, that is on the election front?
I think it's a nail-biting situation, not only for the candidates and Americans, but for all the people in the globe who have interest in the outcome of the US elections. So I think that Mr. Biden probably can win if he carries Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia for sure. But there's a still possibility that President Trump can win again for his second term. So I think we cannot be so sure who's going to win at this moment.
I see. So it's still uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, against that backdrop, Professor Cho, how do you assess the legal battle that the Trump campaign is seeking to wage? Do you share the thoughts of those who claim that Mr. Trump is simply seeking to undermine public confidence in an election that he appears to be losing?
To cut to the chase, yes, I would say so. All the legal challenges that he and his team have been mounting in these contested states are really an act of political desperation born out of the last-minute desperate attempt at clutching at straws, trying to sway public opinion. I mean, he's been laying the groundwork for this for a long time, claiming since months that mail-in ballots, there is greater risk of fraud, and there is voter fraud as well as election fraud. But the judges have thrown out basically all of the legal challenges that they've mounted, and I don't think it's going to come to anything at the end of the day.
I see. Professor Krimmer, I understand you recently partook in an international forum on elections organized by Korea's National Election Commission. Now, as a pundit in this particular discipline, then, what are your thoughts about the election, about efforts by countries, that is, to hold elections amid the pandemic? You could perhaps start with the US.
Yeah, I mean, the US certainly had the most challenging position because I would say the US is still the election wonderland. There is no rule in the world of election that is not applied in this vast majority of about 2,300 different counties that actually can run the elections almost on their own. And so you will find different voting technologies, different rules. You find even different rules for assigning the electoral college mandates, right? So you really have a vast majority of rules that makes it very complicated on the one hand side to predict the election, but on the other hand side also to actually manipulate it, right? And that's the real nice thing about the US election. It's a very robust democratic process. So how they reacted to the pandemic, they couldn't do much. They had to use the existing tools, so their only option was postal voting. And that's different with other countries like Korea, which actually use social distancing measures in a very, very well way. So I would say it's a big challenge for elections. Democracy is under threat, and certainly the pandemic is not an easy way for election commissions to act.
Right. Professor Cho, I also understand dozens of national and regional elections in many countries were postponed in light of the pandemic. As Professor Krimmer had said, it's a very difficult challenge, of course. Could you touch upon the impact of COVID-19 on the election front worldwide?
Right. So I actually checked the numbers on this, and there were about 140 elections, both at local and national level, in many countries around the world since the inception of COVID-19. And about half of them, around 71 of those elections, have been postponed. The others actually proceeded as per scheduled time. But COVID has really produced a significant impact on the way that not only elections are held, but also candidates have campaigned, as well as how these elections have been monitored. And the last part we don't really sort of focus on, but particularly in countries where they have had reputation of elections not being quite fair and free, the presence of international monitoring groups were really important to ensure that at least the elections were run in a fair and free way. And many of those measures couldn't be taken this time. And so particularly on the continent of Africa, where we are actually expecting very important elections in countries like Ghana and so forth, there is a real risk that these elections are subject to manipulation. So not just the voting process itself, but also how people have managed to campaign. They couldn't hold rallies, they couldn't go canvassing. So it really has had a significant impact. But those countries that have been prepared well, including Korea, we've actually managed to do quite well. And in fact, in some places, they've had a greater turnout in terms of votes.
Right. Professor, I would assume that any impact on holding an election then would have significant impact or political consequences, that is. What are your thoughts on this?
I think as Professor Cho just mentioned that it's up to the level of governance in different countries. So I think it depends on how and who made a decision on postponing the scheduled election because of COVID-19. If COVID-19 is the legitimized reason for postponing the election and the people in the country acknowledge it, then it's okay to postpone the election because of COVID. But if anyone in the government wanted to take advantage of the situation for their political benefit, then it's going to have a huge impact in those countries afterward.
I see. How do you assess the impact of COVID-19 then on the US presidential race?
So it was supposed to be having a huge impact on the election. So because that is why many people predicts that it's going to be a tough election for President Trump, because he was criticized for not really responding well to the COVID-19. So, but the election outcome so far shows that about half of the U.S. population does not really think he is not responding to the COVID-19 poorly. So I think it has to be in a way that, as many people think, COVID-19 should impact on the current incumbent president. But at this moment, it's really difficult to say that COVID-19 really impacts the political path of President Trump, because if COVID-19 has a serious impact on the life of the American people, then the result should be already there, not like this.
I see. I understand quite a number of the voters highlighted the importance of the economy more than COVID-19 over in the US. Professor Krimmer, a very sad reality about an election amid a pandemic was brought to vivid light by the story of David Andel, the North Dakota Republican candidate for the state house, who passed away earlier last month from COVID-19, but appears to have recently won his race. Now, I suppose there is no denying that the impact of a health crisis is clear on politics and more. What are your thoughts?
So, elections are a long process, right? Elections don't happen just on one single day. They actually go over a longer period of time, such as having a death appearing during the campaigning period, during the actual polling taking place already, is not something that is uncommon. So that really doesn't have a real direct link to the pandemic and only due to the pandemic. But of course, it happens more frequently. So there are rules in place on how those replacements for elected candidates can actually occur. And that's the important part. So we have rules, those rules need to be abided by, and that's what is at stake and needs to be followed.
Right. Professor Cho, for countries that have successfully held elections this year, including Korea, as you mentioned, voter sentiment appears to have been swayed by the government's relatively effective control of the pandemic. Is this an accurate assessment of the situation?
I think a real good example of that is New Zealand, where, in fact, the general election was supposed to have been held on the 17th or 19th of September, but they actually postponed it by 1 month to October. And as a result of the leadership of the incumbent, Jacinda Ardern, the government actually returned with a majority, enough seats to be able to actually govern on its own for the first time since New Zealand implemented proportional representation in their electoral system. And so I think New Zealand is a case where government reacted appropriately to the pandemic, because the reason why they postponed the election was because of a spike that actually happened in August, and they really felt that they needed more time to take care of the pandemic before they could hold the election safely. And just Ardern's leadership with regard to COVID has been acclaimed universally, because she's implemented some of the most restrictive lockdown measures in the world, and yet at the same time she made sure that everyone was on side. She explained carefully why it was needed. She sort of went through the consequences of what might happen if they didn't observe it. And so although people were virtually prisoners in their own homes, they accepted it and went ahead. On the other hand, we look at America. Dr. Wu actually mentioned that COVID hasn't really seemed to have had an impact, but the pundits were actually predicting that Trump would have won the re-election by about 10%, had it not been for COVID-19, right? So in that sense, I mean, I confess that I had expected that Biden would be declared winner by now, that the American public would have passed a much more harsh judgment on Trump and his administration for their mishandling of the pandemic. But as you said, greater number of people than we expected actually said that economy was much more important for them. And so I don't think they dismiss COVID and the Trump government's poor leadership on that as a non-factor. It's just that for them, other things were more important.
Right. Professor Kramer, Korea held its general elections in April, becoming one of the first countries in the world to hold a major vote amid the pandemic. Now, I believe a manual was published by officials here for their counterparts across the world who were looking to host safe elections. What is your assessment of Korea's general elections back in April this year?
I mean, taking those four options that you basically have when a pandemic hits, on the one hand side, postponing the election, clearly, I mean, that was rolled out. Going for distance voting in the sense of postal voting would require to adapt the rules, would require to actually train people to really establish new procedures. So that's quite challenging in a short time. And even more so when you go for an online option, that would require even years of preparation. So basically, social distancing was the only reasonable option. As such, Korea has set standards and has been a remarkable example for election management bodies around the world on how can you actually cope with a pandemic that actually hits an election period. And so social distancing and elections for that Korea is certainly the best example.
I see. Dr. Wu, elections are a fundamental part of democracy, of course, I'm sure you're aware. And the fact that officials here in Korea and members of the public as well managed to have a safe election back in April, surely that deserves a lot of praise. Who do you think deserves more if you were to compare, the officials in the country or the members of the public?
So it's difficult because there are so many different cases around the world. However, I think that there are a lot of different ways to cast the ballots that we can think of because after COVID-19 that many countries are considering how elections can be held in this kind of situation. So for example, that the United States, the controversy is around the mail-in vote. More than like 65 million people use the mail-in vote. And with regard to the cases in Pennsylvania, one of the Supreme Court justice says that people should not be forced to choose between their health and their right to vote. So I think that it is time to think of the mode of elections just in case that this kind of crisis would happen again in the future.
I see. And speaking of modes of voting, Professor Kramer, to ensure further safety in light of a prolonged battle against COVID-19, I believe several voting options are being considered, including online ballots. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, certainly Estonia, where I'm currently living and doing my research, is known for using electronic tools very actively. I mean, not last we're using actually currently Skype to communicate, which is also a technology that came out of Estonia. So naturally, this country has prepared over several years for introducing electronic voting. So they actually started already 15 years ago, and over the time, they actually built the acceptance with the people. They started with 2%, and in the last election in 2019, almost every second voter, actually used the online channel. Other options, as were already mentioned, are really postal voting or social distancing. But I would say online voting is certainly the one that is most convenient to do it from home, while you can actually protect from voter coercion and other means of problems that could occur with postal ballots. So as such, I would say online voting, if it were not for this long preparation, it's really the method of choice. But, right, you cannot rush it. Like Lithuania has shown, I mean, they decided, or the political caste decided in August, actually it was in July this year, to introduce internet voting for their elections last month, right? So they only had 3 months to prepare, and that's certainly not enough. And so that's what we really need to bear in mind. Good elections need good preparation, and that needs time.
Professor Kramer, you were, like I mentioned earlier, you were at the forum, at the international forum that is on elections here in Korea last month. Would you happen to know where Korea stands with regard to possible online voting?
So, I mean, I haven't followed the debate very closely, but I obviously get that there is a keen interest, given also the stance of proactively using technology. But I'm not aware of the political discussions that are ongoing. But that is exactly the important key. You need to have a broad political consensus in order to be able to reform elections, such as introducing internet voting. When that broad political consensus exists, you can take the preparations to take the long breath that you need to introducing such a new technology to election.
Right. And speaking about such a consensus, Professor Cho, what are the legal considerations that need to be made to allow for proper voter participation and complete transparency in an election process amid the pandemic?
So really the most important principle is how to protect and secure voter franchise, making sure that they have the right and the ability to exercise their vote, right? And as Professor Kramer mentioned, in fact, in a situation like where there is this pandemic and we have no vaccine, no way of real treatment, in fact, online voting would be the way to go. It's the safest way, it's the quickest way, and as long as you can guarantee the security and stability of the network, it's the most sound way to conduct it. I have to mention, I actually conducted a very non-scientific poll among my students about what they thought about online voting, whether we would be ready to actually conduct our election with online voting. And in fact, about 2/3 of my students actually thought that it was too early. We weren't quite ready to implement online voting because they had concerns about the risk of system being hacked, possibly the voter being coerced to vote in a certain way, the stability of the network, but others also thought that, well, it would actually make it much more easy and convenient for people who can't get to the polling station easily, and so forth. And
so, including the elderly citizens, of course.
Exactly. But I think back to my own experience, for example, with online banking. Initially, I was completely wary. I don't want to do banking transactions with my mobile phone. But then once you get used to it, it's the easiest and most convenient thing, and you don't have second thoughts about it. So I think perhaps with online voting or online elections, we might go the same way, but it does take a little bit of time for people to get used to it.
I'm still wary about online banking, though. Professor Zhou, what are your personal thoughts about online voting, though?
My personal thoughts are that is eventually the way that we will vote, I think. But perhaps it may take another decade or so for it to be accepted generally.
Dr. Wu, what are some of the lessons now to be learned from the presidential race over in the US with regard to holding an election amid a crisis?
So no system or no institution can be perfect. And every law is established to provide the laws and the provisions that to cope with the situations like this. But we simply cannot predict what's going to come in the future and what kind of situation that we are going to face. But as we have seen in the elections in the United States so far, I think people are more important than the system or institution. How people are going to operate the system is more important than what kind of system that we have. However, with the pandemic crisis like COVID-19 this year, that people probably acknowledge the necessity of discussion on what kind of modes would be possible in the case of a pandemic, which we cannot travel to the polling booths, or we cannot meet in person. So I think that this is the exact time that we can start to discuss what kind of elections would be possible in the future, because the traditional way of voting, like go to the polling booths and stamping it's not the only way. The purpose of election can be respected through so many different ways. As Professor Cho just mentioned, that online voting if the culture is mature enough, and if there's a system that can backing all the security breaches that we can think of, then I think in the future that online voting might be another way of operating the elections in many countries.
I see. Professor Krimmer, what do you believe are the lessons that can be learned from the election situation over in the US?
From the US, we can learn many things in terms of elections, also how not to run them, right? So I would say the election laws in the US would warrant for a concrete update, but I don't think it's in any way realistic given the current political climate. So all countries that are lucky enough to have done electoral laws in the past, let's say 20, 25 years, are in a much better situation than the US. A part of this, I would say, as has been mentioned already before, people are what elections are about. So how people cope with the pandemic, how they cope with social distancing, that's the important fact, that we actually remain flexible and we don't always believe that we just have to follow this one path. This flexibility is the important thing. And then again, elections are in the end the celebration of democracy and the expression of a culture and identity of a country. So we cannot prescribe a country how to run their elections. They all will need to find a way that is best suitable for their context. And so we should really bear that in mind.
I see. Professor Krim, I'm going to throw yet another impromptu question to you. What are your thoughts on perhaps calls for changes in the voting system over in the US from the electoral college system to a public vote?
I mean, of course, when you come from a different context, you have other expectations and you always believe that the elections in another country are run in the same way as in your own. And then you realize, oh, it doesn't work like that. Oh, it is going differently. So why is that? And as I mentioned before, it's always this expression. It always has historical reasons for an identity of a country. So the electoral system, including the electoral college, is very close to how the US perceives their democracy to be run. So it's very difficult to tell them, you should do it different. But what is clear is the technology that's available at the time when you draft the laws or the way that you run your elections, that's how you define and how you set the rules. If you're not able to update those rules for ages, for even hundreds of years, like in the US, you're stuck with that system. So building in a certain element of flexibility, a certain element of being able to update your electoral rules, that's what is key. And what the US story tells us, the struggle that you have when you're not able to be flexibly adapting your electoral rules, of course, within democratic limits and with the necessary backing of a broad consensus, that's what you can then get stuck in, and having actually, as some might call, dysfunctional elections.
I see. Professor Cho, the next date in Korea's election calendar lies in April 2021, when the country holds its by-election for the mayoral posts of Seoul and the city of Busan. What preparations are necessary here to ensure a safe voting experience?
Our parliamentary election that we held in April of this year has really been touted as a model, for other countries. And places like Singapore have really sort of modeled their election on how we conducted them. And so in terms of in-person voting, I think we just have to make sure that we can replicate those careful procedures that we followed to ensure that everyone who comes to the polling station to vote can feel safe and are also kept safe. But because we have a bit more time, there are other things that we can think about. So, for example, expats who live overseas or who are in other countries, usually they have to either get to the embassy or the consulate in that country to be able to cast their vote. So for those people, I think we can have procedures in place where they can mail in early ballots by post. Dr. Wu mentioned about the controversy with regard to mail-in ballots, but that's really an artificial controversy that was created by Trump, really to cast doubts on the mail-in ballots, which he suspects quite rightly, to be much more skewed towards democratic votes, right? But mail-in ballots have been used for a very long time. All the soldiers who are stationed abroad, from America, they all mail in the absentee ballots, and so we can't really sort of question the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. And so for us, the challenges for the upcoming by-elections next year is how to make sure that the enfranchisement is widely enjoyed as much as possible, and put in place procedures for those.
Right. And staying with mail-in ballots, Dr. Wu, do you believe that mail-in ballots over in the US will play a deciding factor in the outcome of the election?
The thing that now President Trump is questioning is probably not the mail-in vote that arrives before the deadline. Maybe he wants to challenge the validity of the votes that arrives after the election day, such cases like Pennsylvania, which allows like 3 more days for the mail-in ballots to arrive. So maybe he cannot challenge the validity of mail-in ballots which arrive before the election day. So I think he was the actual beneficiary of the vote in 2016 because mail-in vote was there at the time, and more than 33 million American people cast their ballot through mail-in vote. So I think mail-in vote can be the way in case of like pandemic crisis in the future. And in South Korea is not really using the type of mail-in vote system as Americans, but I think it's the time to discuss what kind of like different modes like we can use to guarantee that every people can exercise their right to vote.
I see. Professor Krimmer, as we've been saying over and over again, the US is on course to seeing the highest voter turnout in 120 years, at almost more than that is 66.9%. What do you believe, Professor Krimmer, has fueled this high voter turnout in the US election this time around?
It's not the pandemic, but it's the political conflict around it, right? So as we all know, voter turnout doesn't come from the convenience of voting, rather the opposite, right? It comes from political conflict, from contestants that actually want to win the battle, and it's not a clear race, but it's a tight race, and that's what drives people to the polls, and not the voting methods or different means. But voting methods play an important role on retaining voter turnout over a longer period of time. People become tired of democracy, unfortunately. So once they have learned how to vote, right, when they became a voter, and that is one of the particular issues in the US elections, that, you need to register for the vote. You don't base your voter register on the basis of a population register, and so on and so on. It is really difficult for them to get this feeling, oh, I have a social duty of participating in the election. That's another element that drives up normally voter turnout in countries like in Australia, where it's even a duty to participate in the election. But you still need to learn that, right? But political conflict clearly was the one that drove the Americans to the polls, and that's what needs to be retained. You need to make an election interesting, then the people come.
I see. Professor Krimmer, your words today have been very enlightening. Thank you so much for your time. Professor Cho, as always, thank you for your insights. And Dr. Wu, thank you for being with us today. Right, up next, we reconnect with our Chun Song-cho, who is now within the grounds of Toksugung Palace, to offer us that glimpse of the surprise she was talking about earlier. Hello again, Song-cho.
Hello again.
Right, Song-cho, so tell us what's happening within the grounds of the palace.
Yes, so I'm back, and like I said earlier on, I'm inside Toksugung Palace right now. This palace was built during the Joseon Dynasty in the 16th century to house the imperial families at the time. It may be the smallest one out of the 5 palaces in the capital, but it does not fall short of beauty. Well, the pleasant surprise that I mentioned at the top of the hour is none other than the art exhibition that's going on right now inside the palace. So it features modern art pieces made by some of the most prominent artists in Asia. So a total of 19 local artists, including Park Seo-bo and Kim Chang-yeol, and 3 other artists from other countries have joined the exhibition in order to promote exchange of culture and art in East Asia. I mean, the harmony between the modern art pieces and the traditional architecture in the background is just stunning to me. And entering the ancient compound is almost feels like stepping into another beautifully preserved era, I must say. So right now, let's invite one of the officials from the Palace Management Office who will tell us a little bit more details about the event. So here she is. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi, so this is a very interesting exhibition, but because we're in the middle of a pandemic, I'm sure there are many rules people have to follow in order to prevent any transmissions of COVID-19. So can you tell us what they are?
We disinfect the whole Doksugung area twice a week and restroom twice a day. Doksugung has social distancing markings on benches in front of buildings where the queues may typically form. And there is a special exhibition in Seokjojeon Hall. Online booking is necessary because the number of visitors is limited due to COVID-19. You must do QR check-in, body temperature check, hand sanitizing, face covered before entering the hall. You also need to change your shoes to slippers in Seokjojeon Hall, and all slippers are disinfected just after they return there. We hope you visit Doksugung safe and healthy.
Wow, thank you so much for your answer. Thank you. Wow, that was a lot of safety, health guidelines we have to follow. I mean, yes, this exhibition is partially outdoor, but we cannot let our guards down. We as a nation have to do everything we can in order to have the virus reined in as much as possible. This has been Chun Sung-cho reporting live from Doksugung Palace, and back to Sunny in the studio.
Right, Sung-cho, thank you for that. And I'd like to cast my vote behind your words. Right, well, that brings us to the end of this week's coverage of COVID-19. Starting tomorrow, Korea's revised 5-tier social distancing guidelines are poised to go into effect with a tougher penalty for those who violate mask mandates. So do abide by the proposed measures. Have a safe weekend.
The South Korean government has resumed issuing discount coupons to revive the COVID-19 hit economy. They plan to start with sectors that can abide by the government's social distancing guidelines and then expand it to other sectors. Let's see how the government plans to balance disease prevention and economic activities as the pandemic protracts.
The government has resumed issuing discount coupons beginning with the culture and arts sector. It aims to support consumer spending on cultural goods and services while maintaining effective COVID-19 preventive measures. The coupons will first be distributed at facilities that can follow the preventive guidelines such as galleries, live performance, and movie theaters and sports facilities.
정부는 그간 제한을 받아왔던 국민 여러분의 문화와 여가 활동을 방역이 저해되지 않는 범위에서 조금이나마 지원해 드리고자 합니다.
On one condition, however, safety. Facilities that can benefit from the discount coupon scheme are expected to follow the basic guidelines, such as restricting the number of visitors, wearing a mask, and disinfecting the facility. Based on such measures, hopefully, the program will be able to revive the hard-hit cultural industry.
COVID-19 has put a lot of things on hold, but now it's time to put them back on track. Disease prevention must come in step with policies that revive the economy, such as the discount coupon program. The best way to overcome COVID-19 is to stick to the basics.
Overcoming COVID-19 together. Let's all stick to the basics. growing number of people who have hectic lives look for comfortable places to rest. And there's a company which has strived hard to ease people's mind and body. We look into Mooney Studio, which has captivated the tastes of consumers in the pharmaceutical field. Mooney Studio is a company which develops and provides various items that combine medicines and therapies. Instead of existing services that provide expensive therapies, it has developed therapies that people can enjoy at home at a reasonable price. Chakra Aroma Relaxing Patch, which is a combination of aromatherapy and color therapy, is one of the items developed by the company. And it enables consumers to relax anytime at any place.
저희 무니 스튜디오는 그 지친 몸과 마음을 치유하는 테라피 솔루션을 제작하는 그런 기업입니다. 그래서 저희 첫 번째 제품 같은 경우는 차크라 릴렉싱 패치라고 일반 동전 파스의 그 역한 냄새를 없애고 거기 아로마 향이랑 디자인을 넣은 그런 디자인 제품이라고 보시면 될 것 같고요. 저희가 작년 7월부터 제품을 생산을 해서 지금 판매를 하다가 저희가 이번에는 2차 시제품을 개발을 앞두게 되어서 지금 열심히 일을 하고 있는 중입니다.